Welcome back to another episode of Hipfire. Today we're going to be going over the basic anatomy and terminology when you're looking at a cartridge. It recently came to me after my videos that I dropped with Drew, teaching him how to load ammo, that not all of these terms may be known to the average person. So we're going to go through it. I did this lovely drawing of an example of a rifle cartridge. Um, and we're just going to get right into it. I got my little pointer here. So, all right, so we're going to go over a couple of key terms first. We're going to go to cartridge, which is the entirety of the loaded round itself from end to end. That's the cartridge. The case is from the neck, which is this line here, to the bottom of the cartridge. So that's the case that holds the gunpowder. It is measured in volume, and we'll get into that in a second. So next we have shoulder. The shoulder is this angled portion right here. You do a lot of measurements off of the shoulder. There is a certain line on the shoulder that's called the datum line that a lot of people run their measurements off of. Next we have the neck. Again, is the part of the cartridge that holds the bullet in place. It's this section here. And we're going to move on to primer and primer pocket. So this right here is the primer pocket, and which the primer sits inside of. This is for center fire rifles, or center fire cartridges, I should say. There is such a thing as rim fire, which has the ignition source packed into the rim, like here, all the way around. This is an example of a rimless cartridge. A rimmed cartridge would be something along the lines of a 30-30 Winchester is a rimmed cartridge, and it doesn't have this indent here. It has a accentuated rim here instead. So next we're going to go to the head of the case, and in turn the head stamp for the case. This right here, this section, would be considered the head of the case. And as far as head stamps go, almost every single cartridge ever produced is going to have a head stamp on it, uh, dictating what cartridge it is itself. So for civilian brass, such as 308, 6.5 Creedmoor, 300 Win Mag, the list goes on and on. Anything that's not a NATO spec cartridge is going to have the manufacturer head stamp initials on it, and it's going to have the cartridge um, designation on it as well. Now, for military cartridges such as 5.56 and 7.62 by 51, 51, they are going to have the manufacturer, the year it was manufactured, and the cartridge designation on it. So that's a really easy way to discern what plant the brass or case came out of itself, what year it was produced, and the designation of the cartridge. So moving on, we already covered rim versus rimless. This is a example of a rimless cartridge. It's got a indent here, which is what the ejector claw grabs onto, which removes the spent case out of the rifle. Rimless, again, has the little bulges on the outside and a straight wall here on each end. Now we're going to move on to gunpowder. Now gunpowder fills up the inside of this cartridge. So as you can see, this checkered line here is the head of the case, and then it's kind of dished at the bottom slightly. There's a flash hole here, which we'll get into in a second. And then the gunpowder sits inside of this volume, this cylinder. Now, one thing I want to specify, because it kind of threw Drew for a loop, so I'm sure somebody else gets kind of confused with it as well. Now, the measurements for gunpowder and bullets themselves are measured in grains. Grain is a weight measurement, not a specific volume. So, like, each kernel of gunpowder here doesn't weigh 1 grain. It weighs a fraction of a grain. So it's easiest to think of the gunpowder uh, pieces themselves as granules or kernels. And then grain is the unit of measurement for the total overall weight of the kernels or granules of gunpowder. And bullets are measured in the same measurement grains, because it's kind of like a uniform measurement for weight for when it comes to bullets and cartridges. So then we got bullet is the last thing that we're going to talk about, and that's the little tippy part that goes bang and flies out of the end of the barrel. So now that we've covered the anatomy of the cartridge itself, I'm going to walk you through the very basic explanation of how this all functions. And when you pull the trigger, the bullet goes out the end. So when you pull the trigger, a firing pin gets moved at a high enough rate of speed. I don't know the exact number, but it moves fast enough that it strikes the back of the primer, which sits in the primer pocket, like we said. Strikes the back of the primer. The primer is the initial ignition source for the gunpowder. The gunpowder is just an accelerant to build up pressure in this cartridge enough to send the bullet flying. The primer is what initiates that ignition sequence. So firing pin hits the primer ignites, and then goes through this section here, which is called the flash hole. And that sends the ignition of the primer into the gunpowder. The gunpowder then ignites from the primer strike. And then it's a chain reaction of gunpowder igniting down the length of the cartridge. And while it's doing that, it's producing gas pressure that is building up in here. And what happens is, once the pressure gets to a certain point, it starts moving the bullet, which is not affixed to the cartridge itself. It's just seated in the neck here. It'll send the bullet out. It releases the pressure by shooting the bullet out of the end of the case. And then the pressure continues to build and carry that bullet out the end of the rifle. So that's how that whole process works. We went over some key terms. We clarified the grain versus gram versus granule or kernel, if you will. We went over some key terms, stuff that should be known if you're ever going to get into reloading. These are just some generalized stuff you need to know before you even start thinking about loading your own ammo. So that'll do it. That is the end of this hip fire. The anatomy of a cartridge. I hope I broke it down simple enough for anybody who has any amount of experience reloading, not reloading, shooting, or a brand new person to the sport. I hope I broke it down enough that everybody would be able to take something away from this and have learned something in this process. So, till next time.